Hi, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Chockie Tom, and I am Pomo from California and Walker River Paiute. I am the co-founder of Doom Tiki, a non-appropriative, immersive fundraising pop-up that fundraises for various communities dealing with the after effects of colonization. And I'm an Indigenous advocacy um, Indigenous visibility advocate. We got that finally. And thank you for joining us today for a multi-nation discussion on moving from the mythology of Thanksgiving to celebrating modern Indigenous America. There are four things we would like to ask fans of this content to do one is to like us on Facebook. Two is to subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Three is to follow us on Instagram. And please feel free to comment below and ask any questions while we're discussing it. And joining me today, I have three of some of my favorite Indigenous folks. If you guys would like to all introduce yourselves, we'll start with Janelle.
Hi, everybody. I'm Janelle Carey. I'm Mashpee Wampanoag. Does anybody want to go from there? Or should I say a little statement?
And then also explain a little bit about what that means just in context for our listeners, please, our viewers, please.
Sure. So I'm very excited to be here as a Mashpee Wampanoag because my people are the Native American tribe that greeted the Pilgrims in 1620.
All right. And we'll take it over to Roxanne.
Hi, my name is Roxanne Fernandez Tiburolobo. I am Chiricahua Apache from the Bidonkahe band and also Raramuri. And I've been working on the production side of alcohol as a craft brewer and now as a distiller for about 8 years in the industry. And I'm currently distilling at Sonoma Distilling out in Sonoma, California.
And we'll send it over to Jennifer.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jennifer Brandt, and I am Cree. My mom is from Winnipeg, Manitoba, taken in the 60s scoop to Vermont, so that's where I grew up. I have worked in hospitality in various capacities for over 20 years at this point, everything from bartending, waitressing, management, to I actually worked at a cider company, and I'm just about to launch my own food company, a Vermont food box as well, so all the aspects of it. Yeah, and I also have my own company called Eighth Nation. I do event coordination, and I've been really lucky in the past few years to really be able to focus on Indigenous food systems. So I've done a bunch of panels, organized panels. I'm actually on the panel myself, and I'm the guest editor this month for the kitchen for the Indigenous food series for November.
And thank you for joining me. Before we start, we have a little warning that we're going to put up. So, content warning for our relatives. We will be covering some topics that are traumatic and that we're kind of sick of discussing, but everybody else, for the sake of education, real history is very different from what you learned. And a lot of the things that we cover aren't going to be as nice as you've been told. So, this will bring us to our first section, which is next slide, please. What the F is a paper bag vest? And if you look here, which is a picture that I found on Google from within the last few years, it's a bunch of non-Indigenous children in a very stereotypical hand gesture, imitating what we apparently all nearly 600 of our nation sound like, dressed in imitation leather vests made from paper bags and really crappy cutouts. And when I was going to school in the 1980s, this was a standard craft thing that took place every single year in our classrooms for Thanksgiving every November. That's what we had to look forward to. And as I've mentioned before, fall is the most exhausting season because we kick it off in October with a lot of people very angry that we want there to be truth and we want to do away with the lie that is Columbus Day, which was created to help other populations like the Irish American and Italian Americans acclimate at the expense of telling the truth about our people, which then takes us into October, which is always full of fun conversations about, no, please don't wear our sacred regalia as a costume. We're actually people. This is disrespectful. And by portraying us as a sexualized costume, this is actually perpetuating a lot of problematic behavior, which results in real life sexual violence for murdered and missing Indigenous people. And that brings us back around to what Thanksgiving is. So I was wondering if anybody wanted to share some of their experiences, what growing up knowing that this was a lie was like for you, and how does it make you feel now that this really inappropriate craft, and of course we have had a couple friends, kids who have been sent home with paper crowns because that still happens every year, but how does that make you feel? And we can start with Roxanne.
Certainly. So some of my earliest memories of Thanksgiving, in particular, revolves around my kindergarten Thanksgiving Day play, where we had to make the little paper Indian costumes, and my dad having to come in and yell at people for that, which is a really othering experience. And feels weirdly like makes you feel like ashamed and alienated in a group of people when that has to happen, even though that shouldn't be happening in general. I grew up in a similar time as you. I was born in the 80s. I grew up this would have been in the early 90s ish. But this is still a thing that goes on. My niece actually had a similar experience where my stepmom had to come in and yell, because she's actually an educator. She does the Indian education in San Bernardino City Unified, and had to come in and yell at my niece's first grade teacher because they were making her dress up as a paper Indian, like the little paper bag vest Indian all over again. So it's an ongoing problem that's really like humiliating and alienating in some ways, because you feel very othered in those situations. But also, when you're that young, you don't fully understand the context of it. I think, as you get older, like with the grasp of what being Native means and existing in that system, it becomes even more sort of like a sense of anger with regards to that, because you feel, again, it's like, it's insulting your culture, it's trivializing it, it's making it cartoonish, it's very focused on keeping you in this view of the past, like we don't get to exist as modern day people when we're presented in that format. It's always this vision of the past and this really romanticized, again, sort of cartoonish version of the past. Yeah.
Jennifer, what have your experiences been like?
Yes.
And I think also I was discussing with you that in a lot of ways, and we were discussing how Thanksgiving and the mythology is kind of the birth of American hospitality.
Mhm.
Well, and you had some interesting thoughts on that I'd like you to share as well.
Yeah, I was certainly, so I grew up in Vermont, and so a pretty different experience from, I think, a lot of folks, in the sense that we were pretty like aware that, like, I was never not aware that Thanksgiving was a lie, and it was something that was talked about in my schools, and it was, very liberal. But on the flip side, something that I think is a really strange phenomenon is oftentimes when people would ask what I was and they were trying to figure that out, and I would let them know I was Native American, they would say, "Oh, that's really cool." That would be a really common response. And it's sort of like going back to the romanticization of Native people. It's like, well, it's not been that cool for a while. My mom was literally stolen from her family. And the traumas that have happened for a lot of us aren't even, one generation away. A lot of these things are happening to us to this day. And so to say that it's cool, it's very flattering, and it's very fantastic that people really care so much and really want to know. But at the same time, if you want to know these things, you do know these things, then like, what are the next steps? What do you do? What are you doing for the folks if you have this knowledge? And that's something that's very frustrating to me, because just because you think that something, you admire something and that you respect something, doesn't mean you're doing it any good. If you just know about it, you have to kind of take the next step and be an advocate and be an ally and listen. And I think that's the biggest allyship lesson, I think, for any allyship, right? In our conversation we had about, the first hospitality, it's like this giving nature. And again, not a monolith, but I think in general, there was so much that was given and so much that was just taken for granted. Like, that's just how you do things. This is, people are starving, we're going to help you out. And then it's just take from there. And it's really kind of, to me, defines who we are as Americans. I mean, even look at sort of the past year of the Black Lives Matter protests and everything that's been going on. And like, just things haven't changed. I think right now, to me, a lot of times I feel like they're worse than ever. So it's my little spiel about that.
And then, Janelle, what has the experience been like, for you growing up with this? And then now that you're a teacher, what is the experience like for you teaching the next generation of people about your own history?
So, I'm going back deep in my mind when I was in elementary school in the early 90s. And I think I had a different lifestyle because, like, where I'm from is where the Wampanoag are from. I'm from a town called Mashpee in Massachusetts on the peninsula of Cape Cod. So I remember in first grade building like the headbands, but that was it. Like, I don't think anything went past that. I kind of have this feeling that somebody in my tribe stopped that quick. But I do remember these times, like learning about the Thanksgiving history and taking my knowledge and bringing it home to my father. And my father's white, and him kind of just like attacking like what I was saying. And I remember having this like almost like a power struggle with him, because he was telling me the right thing and I was telling him the stuff that I was being brainwashed with. And I would get really mad at him about that because I was just kind of trying to fit into like the society and everything. But now looking back on that, I'm very thankful that my dad was like that, because he was telling me at a very young age, like, don't listen to this. It's not true. And so I live with that in my life forever. So I've spent many years working in the restaurant industry too. And I'm sorry I didn't introduce that self about me in the beginning. Like when I was working there, I would always get these questions from other people like, oh my God, what are you? And that never offended me because I was kind of excited to be like, I'm Native American, because there's not a lot of us left. But what would happen all the time without doubt was after Native American came right out of my mouth, I would get, oh, so you go to college for free? You have a casino? Oh, do you get money from that? Those would always be the questions. And those questions are absolutely offensive. And I even had to say that to a woman. I was like, that's kind of offensive what you're saying. I had to pay for college. And her response to that was, well, maybe you didn't look in the right place, because I know this Native American that got to go to school for free. And I had to just walk away. So after dealing with that for like 15 years, I decided that I wanted to be a teacher and help children from different type of backgrounds similar to mine. So I work in a school that is predominantly people of color. I think it's like, I don't even think there's any white students there. It's actually like a very diverse school. It's really cool to be in that kind of environment. And because it's in San Francisco, I have like the flexibility to kind of teach them what I think is important, like what I want. So this past November, I kind of been pushing like the real story of Native Americans onto my students. But because they're sixth graders, it kind of has to have like a little bit of sugarcoating to it. But I let them know that it, like, what they know of it isn't real. And I also kind of, just tell them at least the name of the tribe of the people, because something that bothered me so much growing up is that the story that you hear, it's like, oh, the Native Americans that, and they kind of just put us all in this like grouping, but they don't talk about the different tribes. So my whole life I've been like, no, it's the Wampanoag. It's not just this Native American people. It's this group. You need to know these people. So that's kind of been my emphasis like this year on that.
And I think it's also interesting too that even at the beginning of this month, with that really racist teacher in Riverside that, fighting for acknowledgement and fighting for respect is still such a big struggle. And if anyone didn't see that, look it up. I don't want to play the video. I don't want to look at it ever again. But I know that pretty much every person I know that's Indigenous has dealt with a teacher that has done something like that. I spent most of fourth grade being bullied by a teacher that would do really mean things and send me out of the classroom and interrupt my education anytime I corrected her when she was like educating me about one of the tribes or nations that I actually belong to, which is from California. So, you have that kind of background going into it. And then we'll go to our next section.
Could I just say something real quick? I just
Sure.
going on that too. Yeah, I was just trying to think of like things that happened when I was growing up, but I think I blocked a lot of them out because I've just been such an activist for so long and fought so hard to like have my voice heard. But I had a teacher too who she was just all kinds of crazy, and she again, she didn't even like mean anything by this, like she just her generation. But I remember one time she told me that we were doing an archery class and she's like, "Oh, I thought you'd be good at this." And I was like, "Why?" She goes, "Because of your people." And I was like, and luckily, like she was nice enough, and she would say inappropriate things to me all the time. And so every time she did that, and I hated gym class, I'd say, "So I can go to the library again today? You're gonna write me a note?" And she'd be like, "Okay." But like, this was just, it's commonplace. And this is in our generation. This is in the almost 2000, the 90s. Like, so if you think this is something that happened in the past, it absolutely hasn't. So I just want to add that on too.
I'm terrible at archery too. I'm better at throwing knives and axes.
Exactly. Archery's it's hard.
Yeah. All right, let's go on to the next panel because this one's a very special one. So a lot of people inevitably end up asking you, what do you do for Thanksgiving? I mean, do you guys still eat a lot? Are you sad? Do you like still hang out, or do you go for like Chinese food like the Jewish people do on Christmas? I've gotten a lot of interesting questions over the years, as well as lots of invites to family dinners. And I've had experiences both with conservative uncles that think that I didn't grow up speaking English or wearing shoes, and then also being in the Bay Area with very well-meaning liberal types that also thought that I didn't grow up with shoes and grew up selling jewelry by the side of the road. It's just the questions you get when you get invited to these meals is that they're pretty out there. But the more modern way that's been going for a lot of our community, especially on both the East and West Coast, is a day of mourning, whether you celebrate by going to Alcatraz or what's happening in this picture. And this is a very important picture, and it's actually features one of our panelists, Jannel. Do you think you could tell us a little bit more about the context of this picture and how your community deals with Thanksgiving?
So this picture was taken, I want to say in 1992. I was about 8 years old, I think. And I remember this day very vividly. It was cold, it was rainy, and my parents made me go to this protest. And I remember, because of what I learned in like elementary school, that like we're supposed to be celebrating. But instead, my parents, they kind of were pushing the truth on me a lot when I was little. So they made me and my sister go to this protest. And I remember just being so upset about it because it was cold and I didn't want to do it. And then there happened to be this woman there taking pictures, because a lot of people in the Wampanoag tribe go to Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts to mourn. And you can see in the distance of this picture is the replica of the Mayflower. So everyone kind of goes down there and has like a protest to make it known that we're still here and we're the tribe that started this whole thing. So I just kind of remember turning around, and there was this woman who wanted to take a picture of me and my sister, and my dad said it was okay, only if she was to use my Native American name, which is Weetamoo. And it's kind of funny because over the past decade, this picture has been circulating like all over the internet. And last year, it kind of just blew up. It was on everything. Like it was in Time magazine, it was on Yahoo News, it was just kind of everywhere it could be. And I remember seeing it a couple of times, and my name was spelled wrong. But I didn't get offended by it, because what's the point of being offended by that if nobody's coming to me, the direct source of like what this is about, and like to talk about it. So we kind of just use this day to kind of remember like what truly happened. And it bothers me because in a sense I do celebrate Thanksgiving, right? Like I'll eat a lot of food. I've gone to other people's Thanksgivings, but I always make it a point to be like, hey, like you were celebrating this quote unquote real Thanksgiving with like a Wampanoag. Like I am a descendant of the people that helped. And I think like what upsets me a lot about this holiday is it's just like it honors just the pilgrims that came here, and they came here by accident. They were trying to come here or they're trying to come to North America, and they were going to go to Virginia because Jamestown is kind of where everything started to happen, like colonization happening down there. But they accidentally wound up in Providencetown, which I don't know if you can see my whole arm, but Cape Cod is shaped like an arm, and the very top is P-Town. And they landed there. Yeah, if you can see it right here, it's P-Town. And they landed there, but they decided to keep going. They landed over here, which is Plymouth. And they decided to stay there. And one of our great sachems, he helped the pilgrims survive their first winter. Because if you know anything about Northeast, it's pretty cold, very hard, very survivalist like winter. So he helped them, and he helped them like learn how to grow crops using our three sisters, like which are like squashes and beans and corn to help them like survive. And this whole Thanksgiving is supposed to be about them like celebrating how they survived their first winter, and now they have all this plentiful food and everything, which is kind of true, but also like it's definitely not true. Like my people weren't even allowed to eat dinner. They didn't want us there. And the real celebration of it all is they heard the pilgrims having this celebration, and they heard gunshots go on. And the chief of the tribe took 90 of his men, left women and children in their village to go see what was going on. And they saw them in the distance having this dinner. They weren't invited to it at all. But I think after conversation, then there was something that like led on from there. But it wasn't this like happy, like, oh, thank you, Native Americans, join us, have dinner. It was nothing like that at all. So that's just kind of something that has always bothered me. And so this past year, this past weekend, the Plymouth, where all this went down, had a celebration, and it was called America's Hometown Parade and Celebration. And I looked it up because I wanted to see like if we were going to be honored. And out of all the floats that were there, the Wampanoag only got 3 floats. And I was just kind of reading about them because I was like, well, what kind of presence is going to be there? And I came across this one slide about float number 5. And it's called The First Thanksgiving, 1621. And it says right here, pilgrims and Native Americans came together for a 3-day harvest festival. About 140 gathered, probably in October, where they both gave thanks to God for his provision. So that was one sentence that angered me so much, because we didn't come together at all, and we weren't together giving thanks to God. The pilgrims left England in search of their own religious freedom, and they came over to here, and because we weren't believing in their God, we believed in our own God, which is a creator. They started to slaughter us, right? Like, because we seemed like we were savage, like we were like these like Satanist people, and we didn't believe in Christian God. So that's kind of what started a whole like fight. And all this history I could go in super detail. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm just spitting out some of this stuff. But I just wanted to make apparent that that's what's being said online and a televised event 400 years later, which isn't even true. And then also this other part of this float said that we met in friendship and recreation, which, as I've said a few times, that is also not true. So I think that's pretty much what I could share with the small amount of time we have.
Well, thank you for that modern perspective, just because I know that your community in general the last few years has been dealing with all sorts of issues with land and just a bunch of bullshit, which always would strike me the wrong way. Is, oh, they're struggling to get their land back after another treaty wasn't honored or some other legal loophole, and everyone's talking about how thankful they are for America. And that also reminded me of Standing Rock, when everybody was celebrating and eating indigenous foods that are now part of American cuisine, but our own food isn't considered part of it. And our water protectors were being pepper sprayed, and elders were being attacked, and and there were water cannons. So it's always kind of struck me very odd. And one of the other things, though, that I thought was interesting is in 2018, that was like, I think, the funniest Thanksgiving that the indigenous community has had in a while, because there was that missionary that decided to invade that island off the coast of India, I believe it was, and he got shot full of arrows. And I'd never seen so many funny indigenous memes in my life. But Roxanne, do you have any perspective on a day of mourning and how that is where you're at in the Bay Area?
So yeah, usually in the Bay Area, we have two sunrise ceremonies that'll happen throughout the year. One on Indigenous Peoples Day, formerly Columbus Day, for obvious reasons, and then the other one on Thanksgiving, which we consider a day of mourning in the greater Bay Area, urban Indigenous community. And so there's usually an early morning boat that goes out to Alcatraz. Alcatraz is of significance to the American Indian movement because it was occupied. That we actually just celebrated the anniversary of the occupation 2 days ago. But it was occupied for almost 2 years when we were trying to get treaty rights enforced and things like that. And in retaliation for the U.S. government continuing to violate treaties and continuing to mistreat us. So it's a significant place for the American Indian movement and seems like the appropriate place for a day of mourning. I try to make, personally, on Thanksgiving, I sometimes have made that ceremony. I tend to make the Indigenous Peoples Day one almost every year. I usually pick one or the other, though sometimes I try to make both, but it's just a day of prayer. You take the boat out, we all gather. It's a day of prayer and ceremony where we come together and kind of, talk about our struggles, but also to celebrate our continued existence. We talk about, elders will talk about how important it is that we're still here, that we remember that we're still here, that we keep our traditions alive and things like that. I take it that day personally, like I said, after, if I do go to ceremony, then I usually still, whether I go to ceremony or not, I choose to take that day to hang out with family and friends, to just sort of enjoy my life and be happy that, we survived and we're still here. I don't be too somber about it, though it's important to acknowledge what happened. And really be aware of that. I try to take it as a day where I enjoy myself. I enjoy the day off. I do things that make me happy. I go to the aquarium a lot. I like being near fish. But again, the general sunrise ceremony is really important. It's nice to be with community and to be in prayer and to just honor. Obviously, we're not. We don't have the same level of trauma, that a historical trauma that the Northeast tribes do with Thanksgiving, as far as but to all of us, this is a holiday that is very much about mourning everything that came after that as well.
I think one of the most beautiful things that I've noticed happening is people reclaiming our harvest ceremonies and our harvest gatherings, and a lot of just Indigenous people, as we've been active in food sovereignty and rediscovering our roots and exploring ways for us to be healthier and looking into non-processed foods and not being as dependent on what the government gave us and the issues that's caused. But just kind of being yes, most of us harvested stuff in the fall, and then we would all get together. We have our Pine Nut Festival in Paiute country, and it's everybody would get together and eat and, celebrate that whole year. So I think that that's been one of the beautiful things that I've seen kind of come out of this. Jennifer, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah, so I'm just writing some notes for myself so I can stay organized here. So because my mom was taken in 60 scoop, and for a little bit of context about that, it was Canadian residential schools and also adoption agencies that were systematically separating Indigenous folks from their families. So my mom was adopted when she was about 10 years old into the States. Her mother had passed away. Her father was still around, but she had multiple, cousins, aunts, uncles, and older siblings that were willing to take her in. But because it was through Catholic organization and through with partnership of the Canadian government, denied requests to have her stay with her family. And it was thousands of kids that were in the same boat. She just won a lawsuit this past year. And she also, her two younger brothers, she had never found, and we had been looking for them our entire lives. So we had always been trying to find them. We literally would watch Unsolved Mysteries to see if we could see them on there. I finally did find them through Ancestry this past year as well. And both of them, they had been adopted together. They knew that they are Indigenous, thank God. But, there's a lot of trauma that they had gone through. So 50 years without seeing my mom, without them seeing each other, and my uncle came to visit New York where I live, and my mom came and surprised her. And it was this big, beautiful reunion. But, there's still a lot of trauma you kind of have to work through. So Thanksgiving, I do try to celebrate the things that we do have, the fact that we're still here, but I just didn't know really much about anything about my culture growing up. We were separated from everybody. And that's really the case for a lot of Indigenous folks, and it was systematic and it was for a reason and it was successful. So what I try to do with all the work I do is just sort of hear other people's stories. So when I do these panels myself, and when I do, I have this series in the kitchen, it's really just me not knowing anything and coming from, just a blank slate and just trying to gain that knowledge myself. So Thanksgiving now is mourning. It's mourning the lost women and girls, as always. I mean, some of my family is a part of that. High suicide rates, which is something we don't talk about a ton, but that's really hit my family quite a bit. And just, mourning that, but also just being so thankful that you can be with family and friends, and that we, it's not great, but it's a different era than it was, even 30, 40 years ago. And at least there's some movement towards recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day, taking the Columbus statues down, which I, had done some of that work with Chockie in New York. But it really is just sort of a knowledge place for me. So I do try to use Indigenous ingredients on Thanksgiving as well, from Native folks. That's really important to me, that we, use these ingredients, but we also get them from the right sources. So, if we're talking maple or rice or whatever, that we're really honoring, not just the ingredients, but who's making them, where they come from, and the intentionality behind them.
And I'm also going to add that even though the 60 scoop didn't technically happen in the same way that it happened in the US, there were still a lot of adoptions. So there were laws put into place to help more Indigenous children be placed with Indigenous families. And currently there's oil firms trying to overturn this so they can undo treaties, and they can undo some other specific laws that go directly to that. So I will be putting something up where you can donate to help, keep Indigenous kids with Indigenous people if they're in the system, instead of letting these oil companies use keeping our children separated to overturn our land rights. So moving on to the next panel, please. So where hospitality gets it wrong. So for me, Adam's Family Values was the first time I had ever seen something that made me happy to be Indigenous in a movie theater. Just because a lot of the stuff that I had seen prior was Peter Pan and that god-awful Indian in the Cupboard movie, which I've been turning into memes all week. But, for me, I started just bartending the day before because I don't celebrate that. And if I'm home, it's with other people, and it ends up being a day of celebration of survival. But I don't know, after going to enough awkward Thanksgiving meals, I'm good, But I used to play this on a continuous loop throughout my whole bartending shift. And I would encourage the patrons that came in, just because I was so grumpy about the whole thing, I'd pick a different charity and I'd donate something every single year. And that's how I coped with it in hospitality, because, I had one bar job where everybody thought that it was cute if we'd come in costume, and they were just like, you can wear like your Indian clothes. And I was just like, I'm not going to work here much longer. And also a lot of choice words that were not very nice, but and just also like having bosses ask me questions like, do you think you could put like a native prayer on our menu that we're going to offer this prefix in your language? And I was like, well, first of all, I don't have that. I mean, I am currently learning it now, but also, it was beaten and molested out of our children in residential schools. Like, that language isn't there for a lot of us. And even if I had it, it's not yours, and I wouldn't feel comfortable sharing it. And that's completely inappropriate for you to ask me that. But, experiences like that, experiences where people think it's still funny to make jokes about Native people being too sensitive on cocktail menus, putting half naked Indigenous women on your menus, and, just kind of like still maintaining all of this attention in media and stuff towards Thanksgiving, instead of being like, well, November is Native American Heritage Month. And maybe instead of doing all of these harmful things that are finding out aren't true, maybe we should stop doing that, So that's where I feel the industry gets it wrong. Roxanne, do you want to lead off with what some of your experiences are and what your viewpoint is on what we get wrong in our industries about this?
Well, I mean, strictly from, the production side, obviously, we've talked extensively about how like naming is a big issue, and like taking sacred names and naming particularly like beer products and other things like that. But I think that extends in the hospitality industry to things like cocktails and and cocktail menu names, where we get these names for our ceremonies and for our significant people, used as like just random names for cocktails without any sort of permission. There's also this kind of idea of like decolonizing Thanksgiving that like a lot of non-Indigenous bartenders will take, and they'll take Indigenous ingredients and just throw them in a cocktail and think that that's enough, without thinking about, again, like the sources, where are you getting these from, without acknowledging. You just throw them in a cocktail and there's no acknowledgement, there's no explanation of that on a menu. Like, who kept these these particular foods alive, or like, why are they here, where do they come from? You just see a lot of that going on, where it's this very like surface level attempt. And I would like to just say that it's like, there's definitely relatives of ours that fully believe that, decolonization of Thanksgiving isn't a possibility. It's a colonial holiday. Like, like you can't decolonize a holiday that is based on colonization. That's the whole point of it. So, this whole idea that you can do that by throwing, pumpkin or cranberry in a cocktail, I think is the most egregious example of it in hospitality. That tends to be the one that I see the most.
Jannelle, would you like to share some of your perspective on this and some of your experiences in hospitality?
I'm lucky enough to say that I've never worked somewhere where I have people say, oh, you should wear this because it's Thanksgiving, or we should make this because it's Thanksgiving. I've never had that happen. And maybe it's because like they know I would have stuck up for that or something. So I'm not sure like why, but I'm really thankful that I didn't have that. As for me, I spent probably like 4 or 5 of my past Thanksgivings working that day. And I would always wear my wampum earrings my mom made that day, just in case at any point I had the chance to be like, and I'm Native American, and this is what happened. Just in case that conversation wanted to come up, I was always like ready for it. But I haven't had any like negative experience with it, luckily.
And Jennifer, what's your perspective on this?
I wouldn't say specifically on Thanksgiving either. I've always taken the day off, and I've always threatened that they better give me the day off because it's my day, and how dare you. but I definitely, we had a conversation recently about like the firewater thing and how Indigenous folks can't take alcohol as well. And honestly, I internalized this, and I internalized this until far too recently, right? Like I really thought that there was a difference between Indigenous people and other people, until you kind of realize that like almost every culture has a drinking problem. So like that's really not a good excuse either. And that it's a lie perpetuated to, make us seem less than, make us seem other, make us seem weaker in any other kind of way. But yeah, people have said to me, oh, we work at a cider company, hard cider company. Isn't that dangerous for an Indigenous person? And even in a joking way, it's like not cool to say that. So it's that, you're a bartender. How can you be a bartender, a Native American? And I'm like, well, it's just the unbelievable things people think that they can get away with saying because they can and because they do. So it's like, it's either making jokes about me not being able to drink or it's so cool you're Native. I'm like, well, what is it? Because it doesn't seem super cool to be really addicted to alcohol to the point where I can't even bartend. Like, it can't have it both ways. So I guess just that. And I guess I've just never really held back and just been like, my job isn't worth it. It's never worth it for me to just sit here and be quiet and not really have to take a strong stance if somebody's saying something inappropriate or that makes me uncomfortable. And the what are you question that Jannelle was saying earlier, I don't know. I didn't really care as much, and it kind of depended on the context, but my mom would get that question and she would get so livid. My mom also worked in hospitality for many years, and she would be like, well, what are you? And always kind of throw back in their face. And it was never very interesting, obviously, because they were just white. But she kind of instilled that in me, like, well, okay, we can have this conversation. And I'm not super offended, but I also like, what's the motivation for asking me this? Like, why do you need to know what I am? And it's kind of this colonial mindset again. I had a lot of very interesting interactions. I also worked at a tourist town at the time. So it was a lot of white people coming in who would just be in and out. It's not like a community where people, I would get to know them, and that might be a different kind of conversation. It's people who I might never see again. So I think another impetus for me to just not care and be like, well, here's what I think. So long-winded. There's a lot of stuff.
All right. And we'll move on to the next slide. I'd also like to remind everybody that we are open to respectful questions. So feel free to ask away. I notice a lot of times, especially when I'm hosting Indigenous content, people kind of feel like a little bit intimidated. And I think we cover so much of like the things that we're sick of answering that I'm sure there's a bunch of other questions too that are out there that we're also open-minded to. So if you're not asking us to come to your house and how much it costs for Thanksgiving, I think we're, feel free to start asking away as well. So we'll go to the next slide. And this is the important thing, especially since one of the big harms of the mythology of Thanksgiving is it puts us in a place and time and traps us there. It puts us in a past tense. It doesn't, speak to some of the things that are going on now. And, because of great content that I've been able to help collaborate with Portland Cocktail Week, like, people realize that there is an Indigenous foods movement. There are Indigenous people bartending. There are Indigenous people making delicious wine, beer, and distilling. And, we come up with our own cocktails, and there's all these cool ingredients that we have. So, now that these conversations are happening, I think it's finally like, and there's just with social media and the more information that's available, and even with like great TV shows and movies and bands and things like that, like, there's more visible, I don't want to say evidence, but there's more visible content of us existing as modern people, just like you or your friend or your family. And, the big focus this month for at least me with collaborating with Portland Cocktail Week has been to show that we're still here and that we have interesting stories. And there's a lot of conversations that we need to have or finish, and, just creating that space. So instead of, talking about having to fight for a seat at the table, we want to sit at the table, but we also want you to acknowledge that the table is on stolen land, and the people whose land it has been taken need to be part of your diversity conversation. So what do you feel is next? I will shoot this one over to Janelle first.
So I just want to take a little bit of a positive twist too, because I feel like we're lucky to live in our time right now where people are starting to care more about us, right? Like with the show Reservation Dogs, like showing a different perspective of Native life. Like that is absolutely amazing to me. And I loved watching it and I can't wait for more, right? So that shows like a different perspective. That makes me happy. I love the changing of the name of Indigenous People Day from Columbus Day, and seeing like the statues being taken down. Like I think we're living in like a positive time, right? And I think it's just going to get better and better. I'm hoping. And now that like I had teachers messaging me from Massachusetts, like, "Hey, Jannelle, like, can you like share with us like some information about the real Thanksgiving?" So I teach my classes this. I'm like, "Oh hell yeah, I got you." It's cool to live in this time to see people like changing their mindset and caring more. So that makes me happy. And then also too, like I've been living in San Francisco for a long time, which is so diverse, and we have so many different types of food, anything you could imagine we have here, but we don't have like Indigenous American food. And I love that I just heard about an Indigenous person opening up a little cafe on Ocean Beach. Who he was once an alcoholic, and that makes me happy. It's like a non-alcoholic like cafe. And then there's also in Fruitvale, a Native woman just opened up a restaurant. I can't remember the name of it, but I know that that's new. So it just makes me happy to see these like positive changes happening.
I'm going to turn this over to Roxanne because I know that he knows all the names of these places and has been to them as well.
I was just gonna say, particularly the Fruitvale one. That's Crystal Wapapa, who's it's called Wapapa's Kitchen, which is the same name that she used for her food stand, which would be at all the North Bay powwows. It's really exciting to know that there's a brick and mortar. I haven't actually visited yet. They just opened. I missed the soft opening because I was out of town for my grandmother's funeral, and then they just recently opened, and I haven't had a chance to drive down, but I'm very excited to see Native American cuisine out here. And there's also they've been down for a little bit because everything that was going on with COVID and stuff, and I think they're moving into a spot near the with UC Berkeley on near the campus area, but there's the Alone Cafe too, also in the East Bay. As far as food is concerned, as far as what I want to see with regards to like the future and the things like that, and acknowledging us and moving into that whole like idea of us as modern people, I think it's important to while we talk about this whole like you can't decolonize situation. So here's the thing. I know I'm never going to convince y'all to like non-Indigenous people to be like, hey, stop having your big meals and maybe spend the money that you would spend on that and give it to Indigenous folk. I doubt that that's going to happen, but I'm saying if you're still going to celebrate this, if you're still going to have these meals, you should definitely look into buying products made by Indigenous people. So if you're using all these ingredients, try to source them as much as possible from Indigenous farmers, from Indigenous people who are making these foods. If you're drinking wine, there's Indigenous winemakers you should be buying from. If you want spirits, there's Indigenous like distillers and spirit makers that are doing these things. There are ways that you can still give back to our communities, that you can contribute to our communities and to the work that we're doing now, not even just our communities, but to individuals who are working as modern people making products. And that's a good way to sort of pay back to us and acknowledge that we're here and that we exist in a modern sense by just interacting with us in a modern sense. So I'd like to see more of that. And again, same thing with restaurants, like non-Indigenous restaurants. Maybe you should consider when you're designing your Thanksgiving menu to like actually source these from like, again, Indigenous farmers, Indigenous growers, reach out to your Indigenous communities and stuff like that. Not just using Indigenous ingredients, but like actually getting them from Indigenous people, actually contributing to your Indigenous communities around you and giving that money back and making sure that you're paying back to those communities. That's really all I'd like to see. Really minimal.
And then another thing that I'm going to throw out, because I know Jennifer has some feelings on this, and I think this is something good to kind of like close it out on. But now that we've gotten to a point where land acknowledgements are kind of like becoming normal. I think it's important to remind people that simply doing a land acknowledgement is not decolonizing your Thanksgiving meal. And if you're still celebrating Thanksgiving, a land acknowledgement isn't enough. There needs to be action. It has to go just beyond being performative. But that knowing on whose land you're living and knowing more about their relationship and having relationships with those communities, that's definitely one of the ways forward, I think. Especially when it comes to sourcing food. So, Jennifer, over to you now.
I do have some feelings about that. So I think next steps are definitely getting to know the individual communities, tribes, etc., cultures because again, I'm sure we can all attest to this. How many times have you read or heard somewhere like blah, 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 a Native American quote or blah, 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 a Native American saying? And you're like, that's not even a fucking thing. Like not all Native Americans said that one thing. That's insane. And to that end too, it's complicated sometimes to talk about Indigenous history in America because we didn't have those borders, right? We didn't have the same way of shaping the way we thought about our cultures, right? There was cultures that went from North South Dakota all the way to Maine, and then cultures that went in the Southwest and in giant chunks, and we all interacted in different ways, and down in Mexico and up to Canada. So it's the borders are arbitrary, and so that for like just to kind of know like what it used to look like here, I think is another good step as well, to kind of like reshaping, like it wasn't just America, Canada, and South Central America. Like it was a way that we moved in a much different system than what we have now. And I'd also like to point out Crystal Wapape. I did some work with her last year, and that she's Afro-Indigenous, and I really want to acknowledge that too. That it's not just the white and Native people that mixed, or Mexican and whatever. There's much more to the picture than I think we really tend to think about. Two-Spirit, Afro-Indigenous. There's a lot of mixing of cultures that I think we need to kind of be cognizant of. We're not a monolith in so many ways. Not just the land we live on, but like the tribes mixed together in different ways. We are mixed with many different cultures, and to kind of acknowledge that as well. But yeah, I think just kind of learning more, and this is for me too. Like I don't know anything, and I'd like to learn more as well. But I think if we learn more of the nuance and not just like Native Americans in general, because that's not a thing, and people who are Indigenous know that.
So I would like to invite everybody to kind of give their final thoughts, and then we'll close it out unless some questions pop up. So Jannel, would you like to lead us off with your final thoughts, please?
Well, one thing I'm just questioning myself right now for Roxanne to answer is, can you share some names of like the Native American like winemakers and distillers? Because I want to help with that. And, like one of my life dreams was to always open like an Indigenous restaurant. And like some of these things that you were talking about today kind of bring back that thought again, right? And like I remember writing down my ideas and being like, oh, I need to find like Indigenous farmers. Like I want to just be able to get all my supplies from them. So I'm really happy that I came here today and heard like perspectives from all of you. And you shared some like ideas with me that kind of came back in my head of things that I would like to do in the future. So I'm really thankful for having this conversation today and being able to share my side of the story. And one thing like moving forward, I really, really want to hope, like I hope one of my dreams is just like, I really want like history books just to start like by mentioning the Wampanoag. Like that's who we are, that's the greeters, and then we can go from there. But we got to start small, right? So that's just my final thought.
Well, you'll be happy to know that there are multiple Indigenous winemakers in California, and I think you and Roxanne are going to have to go out and meet and greet and drink. So, Roxanne, some of your final thoughts, please.
Yeah, well, just because I gotta answer you. A few, just a short list of people that I've done panels with and have had the convenience of meeting is, Tara Gomez, who is both owns the winery Caymans to Dreams and is the lead winemaker at Keto Wines, which is the winery that's actually on the Chumash Reservation here in California, is a good winemaker to go with, Indigenous winemaker to go with. If you're looking at beer, Bow and Arrow Brewing is obviously our friends. And then as far as distilleries, there's actually only one native-owned distillery. There are native distillers like myself that exist in the industry, but there's only one native-owned distillery. Currently, there are some in the works right now, and that's Copper Crow Distilling. And that's because the laws only recently changed in 2018 to even allow us to have distilleries on tribal land whatsoever. That's to answer that question. As far as my final thoughts, I'm just really grateful that we continue to do these little roundtables and these discussions. One, because it's been so amazing to meet other people that work in the alcohol industry, other natives that work in the alcohol industry. There's just not a lot of us, and it's been exciting to meet new people and like really build community here, and I'm very grateful for that. Again, I'm grateful, as Janelle was saying, moving forward, that hopefully, that we live in such a good time as far as like things are beginning to change. People are starting to notice us. People are starting to care and really be interested in changing the narrative around us. And so I'm excited to see that move forward. I'm excited to see us being included and to have more of these dialogues and to get real stories about us out there and what we're currently doing, and change this narrative from this idea of us as these people trapped in the past to who we really are. And that's it.
And Jennifer, your final thoughts, please.
Yeah, I kind of like what you said earlier too. People are kind of afraid to ask questions, I think, a lot of times on these panels. And I just hope that in the future people can feel more comfortable. And I get it. I mean, especially for myself, I come off as and I feel pretty strongly about these things, but I think it's really important to have a dialogue and a conversation that's two-way. So I just hope that we can keep doing these panels. And second, what you said, Roxanne, like this is just fantastic to meet new folks and to just learn, and I'm always learning on these panels. And when I organize them, I learn as well. And I just always want to keep learning. So again, thanks for including me in this. It's been really exciting and really fun.
Oh, and then could you tell us a little bit more about what you're doing this month?
Yep. So The Kitchen is an online publication. And so for Indigenous Peoples Month, for the month of November, I've gathered a bunch of folks together to write their own perspectives. So that is going on until the very end of the month. I believe we have 2 more coming up. So we started in the beginning, and we have just a seed savers. We have Afro-Indigenous folks. We have sort of people doing more modern cooking. So yeah, please take a read at thekitchen.com if you are curious about some more Indigenous perspectives.
Right. I would like to thank everybody for their time and sharing all of their stories and their perspective, and especially Jannel, just because it was really important to make sure that the right person told the right story. And I'm glad that many years later that we were actually able to collaborate on something. And I just want everybody to know that we're all from so many different places. We all have so many different stories, that not a single one of us is a monolith for an entire culture. And we're also still learning how this conversation goes forward as well. So, thanks again to Portland Cocktail Week for giving a space for these conversations and being very supportive. And it's been great to collaborate. There are some things upcoming with them. And then Roxanne and I have an article coming out today that will be posted later. So if you enjoyed this class, please hit the like or love button and show some love in the comments. If you want to see more Portland Cocktail Week classes like this one, follow Portland Cocktail Week on Facebook or YouTube as well. We're also at PDXCW on Instagram, and you can find out coming up what's next there. And if you want to follow what I'm up to for the rest of the month, because it's about my meme time, you can always look me up on Chalk Tales on Instagram. And thank you so much.